Well, it's wonderful to be back here in Berlin. A big thanks to Angie and Rada and the Web3 team, Web3 Foundation team. I'm really happy to start this talk today with a sense of how I think that the Starling Lab, when we got started 6 years ago, was really trying to think about a future that many people at that point couldn't imagine. And now that it's here, I think there's a really critical conversation that we can all have to really shape this future now together, so it's not just us at the margins. And a really good way of thinking about this is to look at some headlines from the recent week. The band The Velvet Sundown went viral, and it was revealed this week that actually the entire band, its backstory, its imagery, and even its music itself amassed, it was 1 million views on Spotify, and yet it's all AI generated. And you might think of this as a milestone in the adoption of how these tools now are so diffuse out there that it can be a new form of expression. That'd be the optimistic way of looking at it. But also really thinking about the general adoption now is something that is really at scale. And to give you a sense of how fast this has happened, maybe some numbers can illustrate this for us. When you look at Web 2 and the titans of Web 2, it took quite a while for them to get to the milestone of 1 million users. And so Netflix, it took about 3.5 years, all the way down to Instagram at 2.5 months. Well, when ChatGPT came out, it took this and it compressed it even further. It went from the fastest at that point of 2.5 months of adoption, it went down to just 5 days. Well, when ChatGPT then went to the next level to produce images in March of this year, well, that timeline became even more compressed. We went from adoption of 1 million users in 5 days with ChatGPT text to just 1 hour. That's the speed in which this technology is accelerating, and anybody should really be thinking about what are the implications of all this, because indeed, if you just do the math from there, if we're on track for, let's say, 100 million images a week with just one service alone, that means within 5 months, just on a linear trajectory, that we would have as many images as produced by AI as the entirety of the authentic 150 years of photography. So we just have emerged from this time period in which we're now reconciling with the explosion of synthetic content amidst an election that was influenced by synthetic imagery, but not necessarily changed by it. And that might be the last election of its kind. So when you look at the images here that were presented, they were quickly debunked because ultimately they weren't realistic enough. But I'd argue, if you look at then other headlines from this week, that the information landscape had been so already seeded with mis and disinformation, with pollution of this kind, that now, when you have this conspiracy in which there's really no understanding of what the truth is of, let's say, controversies like this, there's no question that synthetic imagery is actually playing a role in creating that type of doubt. So 6 years ago, when we started the Starling Lab, we tried to understand how we could use tools, the most advanced tools of cryptography, to help establish a way for dealing with these problems. And we developed a framework that allowed us to think about, in a signal flow, how at each step, as you capture, store, and verify information, you could use cryptography to help establish that new form of confidence. And we began with vulnerable imageries in archives. We took 5 petabytes of video testimony from the survivors of genocide, and we started to think about content addressing technology that hashed and signed imagery to create a new root of trust for the preservation of the authenticity of those archives. We then moved to look at cameras, and so we worked with Reuters to help create new security for every photograph that they took during the 2020 election. And there, we were experimenting with hardware-based forms of cryptography and mobile phones, and eventually that even made it into the cameras themselves. And now those cameras are selling as a mass market opportunity. There, we also experimented with ways of injecting those types of metadata markers for authenticity directly into the photographs themselves. And so standards like the C2PA, which we helped contribute to, really allow you to have now a portable way with cryptography to establish critical information about who took a photograph, where and when they took the photograph. And as part of our work, we established ways for Web3 to be a part of this journey from really the origins of this new standard, which is now being championed by Adobe and Microsoft and others as a way of establishing the authenticity of photography. We moved on to then do work in disputed areas like Syria, where there were critical tasks of documenting war crimes. We moved into then Ukraine. We were taking really ephemeral imagery that was on social media posts and finding ways to put them in a form of a digital evidence bag in which cryptography could help seal both the information and all of the metadata so that in years in the future you could take a fragile Telegram post like this out of an evidence bag and use it as something that could be admitted into a court of law. And that became the basis of a dossier that we submitted to the ICC that provided evidence of alleged war crimes in Kharkiv and Ukraine. And it was really the first type of dossier of its kind to provide extensive legal documentation for those facts that were all backed by Web3 protocols with cryptography. So what we were using here was not crypto as in cryptocurrency, but of course, really the underlying technology, cryptography. And what it can do is it can both protect, encrypt, and it can also authenticate this type of content so that it can actually stand up to the test of time. And in the crypto world as we know it, a lot of the attention and the oxygen is really consumed at the top of the stack. So these are things like crypto assets that deal with things like payments or applications. But really what we chose to focus on were things like storage, content addressing, identity, governance. These types of crypto utilities are a critical part of the Web3 ecosystem, and they're often underappreciated. And we wanted to bring this to the fore to look at how journalists and historians and lawyers can actually leverage these powerful technologies to help strengthen their work. And storage is a really good example of where we began. Here, the challenge was instead of focusing on centralized forms of technology like YouTube or AWS, the idea is how can you form a robust, resilient form of distributed storage. And the advantages here with this type of technology is that it could provide you a way of creating additional capacity and additional processing through these decentralized networks such that you could have more copies of a photograph and also, with the extra compute, a way of ensuring that they can't be corrupted. That set of primitives that we started to leverage really grew out into a larger understanding about how we could design for authenticity. We could establish new forms of trust and new forms of persistent types of next-generation archiving that really became a new stack that we are excited to really bring the practitioners in together to leverage these primitives and build them up as protocols, as applications, and finally uses. So let's think about this. What it really would allow us to do is instead of just spending all our time thinking about downstream fact-checking, it could establish upstream a new way for us to establish trust. And in an age of AI, there's really no question that, in fact, we can't take this for granted. We have to start thinking at the very beginning of the creation of content, if we want it to stand up and be resilient in this new type of information landscape, we have to form new ways of giving people a chance to trust it. You might think of this as a form of digital fingerprint, maybe a notary or an evidence bag. But actually the vision that we like to think about at the lab is a flock of starlings. It's a decentralized network that can form around the image to lower its information uncertainty and really think of it as a collective enterprise. It's one in which all of us together have to play a role in establishing that type of trust. So if I've taken you to the precipice of where imagery is today and how concerned we are about it, we might think of this as a moment of transition that we can thus understand with how we transitioned into the age of images in the first place. And if you go back to the late 19th century, as people were grappling with the arrival of photography, there's a quote that really stood out to me, and this is from Kafka. And he said, "Nothing can be as deceiving as a photograph." And this kind of uncomfortable relationship that people had with the arrival of photography was that there was a reasonable amount of scrutiny as to how these types of new technologies could be, of course, manipulated. And I think that what's so important to emphasize about this manipulation is really how it's a betrayal of the power of this type of medium. David Levi-Strauss has a beautiful book on photography and belief, and he explains that really it's the full possibility and the promise of the photograph that makes its deceit essentially so encompassing. It makes the betrayal so deep. And really, he examines the photograph and its relationship with belief. And I think it's so profound to really think about how this works, is that he explains that it's really a belief that is transitive. It's a willed belief in which photographs are complex and fascinating because of the ways in which we believe in them. And that belief doesn't arise from the subject or the object of the photograph. It actually comes rather from us, from ourselves. And historically, it's really interesting to think about how these types of projections persist over time and how they go onto different objects. So think, for instance, around in ancient times. We had gods and heroes, and we now project those types of beliefs onto celebrities. Or we no longer believe in magic, we believe in the power of technology. We no longer believe in reality, well, we really believe in imagery, right? And now, if we no longer believe in images, well, what do we believe in? And I think the arrival of artificial intelligence is one that really should give us that pause, because ultimately it's creating a whole new set of things that will exist in kind of the post-photographic age. An example, for instance, is this. It takes 3 photographs and it brings it into a world of spatial intelligence. The purpose of this is not just immersion for understanding for humans. Actually, the majority of this type of research is aimed at providing AI a way of seeing the world. Think of it like robots through their mind's eye. This is how they're being trained to spatially understand the world as we see it. Or the other way around. If you look at fMRIs, those signatures now can be interpreted with generative AI, and you can literally peer into someone's thoughts, and you can use generative AI to create a mind's eye view of how they are seeing the world. And so that's essentially now robots looking through basically our own eyes. So in the post-photographic age, there's no question that we're faced with a series of new challenges that require new tools. We presented a framework that we talked about, but I decided in coming here that I really wanted to present an invitation for a larger conversation about a new paradigm and, frankly, a new perspective that we should begin with this work. 6 years into all the things that Starling's been looking at, I can say with conviction that these are the types of things that really persist with our research, and I want to invite folks to come join that conversation. So what might that new paradigm be? I think the first thing we need to really focus on here is that there are going to be no quick fixes or quick solutions. And instead, we need to think about this type of technology development as faced with all sorts of different dilemmas. Professor Hannah Herzog has a beautiful way of thinking about this. She explains that you really have to think about these problems not as things that will have a final, easy solution, but instead a series of complicated choices that you need to weigh the benefits and the costs with. And that in doing so, we need to think really deeply about who's affected by this type of technology and look at a range of different perspectives that ultimately should be included in this decision making. And then when we make that decision, understand there's a price to pay. The team over at Witness has been really smart at thinking about this with respect to authenticity infrastructure for imagery. And those who care about this, I would urge you to really look at this report. It identifies 14 different dilemmas that are really critical in understanding the ways in which there are pros and cons with all of this type of technology. One that I can highlight is from our own experience. We were really excited when there was adoption of this type of technology that we were working on in cameras, and yet I had a sinking feeling that there was something else at stake here, that there was maybe a way to use not just the technology for a form of authentication of where an image was taken, when and where, but if that was imposed on a photographer, it would go from a way of establishing authenticity to establishing a form of surveillance. That's dilemma number 2. And in fact, that isn't even theoretical. In North Korea, they actually use this technology for hashing and signing to condemn people for taking photographs that might be otherwise illicit or inconvenient in its truth for the government. This is something that was developed close to a decade ago. So there's no question that there are trade-offs with this type of technology, and we need to think about the values that we embed in the larger community that's creating these technologies, because indeed, they have profound implications. And so that brings me to my next point, which is that really it requires, in thinking about these types of problems, a new perspective. And I'd like to think about that as kind of reaching back into time with the very people that created the personal computing revolution, the interconnectedness of those personal computers into what ultimately became the internet, the web as we're here today to talk about. And one of the clarion calls within that community was brought out by Stuart Brand through a request to create or to take a photograph. And he asked a simple question. He says, why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth? Because at the time, there were satellites that had picked off different patches or tiles of the Earth. But he wanted to ask, can we actually see all of the interconnectedness of humanity in one shot? And actually bounded around college campuses trying to basically drum up support for this request to ask NASA to just take the satellites and kind of zoom back and look to create a view of the Earth. And he succeeded. And it was a profound photograph because it really allowed people to get into this kind of an understanding of the consciousness and the interconnectedness of civilization. And astronauts put it so well is that when you're in space and you can see the Earth from that vantage point, you develop that instant global consciousness about the orientation around humanity that really goes far beyond the pettiness of the concerns on the ground into understanding how fragile and how unique of a chance we have. And I think that that type of overview effect, as psychologists call it, is really needed. Because if you think about it, it was really what animated the movement of the technologist who brought us the technology that we have today. Brand went on, after he got his photograph, to create a catalog, that the Whole Earth catalog, which was, you can think of it as kind of a user manual to the technologies that would become the internet, but also one that was really a user manual to the community and its values. And what they embedded in this technology was a notion of the end-to-end principle, which is that as you think about the web, it's really designed as a distributed system because it empowers people at the edge of the network. It brings that kind of technical interoperability and the neutrality of the network and the intelligence of the network really to empower the liberty of the individual users of the web. That's essentially why we're all here today, because there was a set of choices that were made, knowing that there were great dilemmas, of course, but a conviction that overall this was the better architecture. In fact, it was the more resilient architecture. And that became the basis of the code that literally was written, but it was really embedded with a moral code in what I'd call the internet code. So in a box, you might think of it, it's a microcosm found in the very first server that was on the web. Tim Berners-Lee very famously put the first node on the World Wide Web with a personal computer. And you had to put a little sticker on it. That's what you see there on the right-hand side, which explained to people this isn't just a personal computer, this is actually a server. And I think that's just such a beautiful imagery of really how this thing was designed in the first place, is that really the end users were supposed to always be in control of the data, control of the compute, and the possibilities of publishing for that personal expression. So if we take those sets of convictions that were so clear to the users of the internet at the beginning, they called themselves hackers because they were seeking there to try to disrupt the information systems of their time to produce something bigger and better. And so if you zoom out and you look at the whole earth of possibilities around AI, what type of values would we want to have? What types of incentives would we want to create to ensure that this type of transformative technology actually is a force for good? I really want people to understand that the rate of change that I was talking about at the beginning of this lecture is a symbol of essentially how important of a moment of transition this is It is really akin to, you can think of the change from analog systems to digital systems. That's really the power of AI, is that it has a ubiquitous impact on our ability to access information. And we need to think about who is being incentivized and how they're being incentivized, or else we're going to end up in a very unfair world in which the technology could be used as really a force of repression and a force of inequality. To do that, it's going to require collaboration. And Web3 technologies provide an amazing way for people to come together and to have regenerative ways of working together to create different protocols that might be able to train algorithms together. Ones that at the edges of the network could provide new forms of specialization and intelligence that could then be networked and provide all sorts of different individuals that might not have as much money as others a chance to leverage the most advanced forms of artificial intelligence. Sounds like a far-off dream, but really, it's only a matter of the types of convictions that we hold that stops us from getting there. And that will lead ultimately, I think, to a new form of resilience around AI in which it doesn't prey upon us, but instead is one that becomes the fullest expression of the possibilities that we would like to have for it. In a sense, we need to think about hacking into those algorithms, and I'd argue to add authenticity as a part of that journey. At Starling, we've been thinking about this for over half a decade. At the beginning of our work, we were asked to leave many rooms that we entered because we were the kind of the crazy blockchain people, right? That were kind of deemed scam artists, charlatans in a way. And we held our ground, and we've really emphasized to folks that actually the underlying power of this cryptography is the thing that potentially could really be the difference between our ability to act in this new digital age or to be preyed upon it. And so there's going to be many talks that you hear today that give you a sense of all the ways in which we can think about the frontier of cryptography and the mechanisms for how to implement it. But I really want to leave you with that sense today of the why we should do this, is that it requires a set of convictions around our values to bring to the challenges of AI, I would argue, a pretty unfair set of advantages, because cryptography has the power of thousands of years worth of math and the refinement of that to give us a chance to hack authenticity and, in fact, bring it in to inject it into the next generation of algorithms of AI. We can do it. We actually have all the tools that we need to get that done. The only question is whether or not we have the courage and our convictions to make that happen. I hope you join that. Thank you.